Recording in progress.
Good evening and welcome to Book Passages Conversations with Authors. I'm your host, Paula Farmer. Please remember to like and subscribe to our channel and put comments and questions in the chat. I promise we will get to them. We know you have a lot of options out there for book talks, so we appreciate your support for our in-store and online events, and we hope you recognize that quality is priority for us at Book Passage, and we carefully curate all of our events. Case in point is tonight's author talk and the featured books. So excited about this one. The new novel, Pomegranate by Helen Elaine Lee, is perfect for fans of Jesmyn Ward and Yaa Gyasi. Pomegranate is a complex portrayal of queer Black womanhood and marginalization in America. It's a story of loss, healing, redemption, and strength. Within an utterly captivating and distinct writing style, Helen paints a humane and unflinching portrait of the devastating effects of incarceration and addiction, and of one woman's determination to tell her story. Helen Lee is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Pomegranate follows her first novel, The Serpent's Gift, and her second novel, Watermarked. Helen was on the board of PEN New England for 10 years, and she served on its Freedom to Write committee and volunteered with its prison creative writing program, which she actually helped to launch. Also tonight, joining Helen is award-winning writer Jennifer Haigh. Her most recent critically acclaimed book, Mercy Street, now in paperback, people, argues both in form and content that compassion is a powerful counterpoint to the conflict-driven stories that dominate our news cycles. With that, I'm going to turn it over to these two talented writers, and so looking forward to this. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having us. It's such a joy to do this conversation with you, Jennifer, because your books have meant so much to me, and I have long admired your work and also your warriorship as a writer, and also because of our friendship and our ongoing conversation about writing and living. So I'm going to imagine that we are on the porch or in the kitchen hanging out as we do. So as Pamela just said, the paperback of Mercy Street recently came out. And so I was hoping to start with you talking about the book, some of the things it's about, what its seeds were, and then hopefully read a short passage.
Okay, thank you, Helen. It's so great to do this with you for Book Passage, which is really one of my favorite bookstores anywhere. Pomegranate is a book I read long ago in manuscript pages and was blown away by. So it's thrilling to see it come into the world and get the reception it's getting. I'm so pleased for you. But Mercy Street. So Mercy Street is my 7th book. It's a novel that draws on my own experience volunteering at a clinic that did abortions. I did this work for some years. In that time, I was trained to answer questions on an anonymous hotline. So women would call with questions about contraception or sexual health, but about half the time, it was a woman calling to schedule an abortion. If you wanted to schedule the procedure at this particular clinic, your first step was to talk to a volunteer like me, who would talk you through the procedure and answer questions. So when I started doing this work, I had no intention of writing about it. It was kind of the last thing I ever want to write about. Abortion is such a third-rail subject in our culture, now more than ever, but even years ago when I started writing this book. And, I would have had to be crazy to want to write a book that would very likely alienate half of my readers or many of my readers, who knows. So it took me a while to work up the nerve to write it. But I came to the conclusion that this work was the most important thing I did. It was the most interesting, most compelling thing I did. Why would I not write about it? So it was kind of taking a flyer, but it was a really rewarding experience. And of course, I never could have known at the time that this book would come out just before Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. So this book first came out in hardcover last year in February. 4 months later, We had the Dobbs decision, and Roe was overturned. So as contentious as I thought this issue was, I had no idea. Like you, I'm not a really fast writer. So when you start out writing a story, you have no idea what world it's gonna come into. And this book surprised me in all those ways. So the main character in the book is a woman named Claudia, who was a counselor at a clinic like the one where I worked. And the story opens with her showing up at work, and the clinic is, as always, surrounded by protesters. So I'm going to read a very short passage of Claudia facing the protesters. The protesters were a fact of life, a daily occurrence like traffic or bad weather. In the beginning, she tried talking with them. She had no experience with religious people and was surprised, actually surprised, at the way every conversation devolved into God talk. Her attempts at rational discourse went badly. On her very first day of work, a man approached her on the sidewalk, a stocky guy in Dockers and a fleece jacket, the most ordinary looking person imaginable. "Please, mother," he said. She can still recall his lilting voice, so gentle it seemed sinister. Also, it was the first time a grown stranger had called her mother, which isn't something you forget. "Please, mother, our Lord Jesus Christ is speaking to you. Please don't kill your baby." He'd been to Starbucks. She could smell it on his jacket. "I work here," she said. The change in his demeanor was immediate, like an actor breaking character. He looked at her as though he'd stepped in shit. "You are doing the devil's work," he told her. Claudia said, "So I've been told." So that's where the story begins. Claudia facing all the things she faces every day, just showing up to do her job. So I will leave it right there and turn over to you, Helen. Set us up a little bit. Tell us about the genesis of Pomegranate, how this story came to be, how you became interested in these characters.
Okay. So in Pomegranate, Renita tells her story of getting out of prison after a 4-year bid for opiate possession and of trying to stay clean, repair her relationships with her kids, own her love for the woman on the inside who's helped to inspire her, and grapple to accept and tell her full and complex story. And Renita's voice is intercut with that of a third-person narrator who brings alive the history that informs her present tense journey. And so, there's so many ways to talk about what a book's about, and of course, readers will have their own experience of that. But the book is certainly about the devastating emotional and psychological toll of this society's retributive carceral system of dehumanization and deprivation and social control, and also its connection to the U.S. history of enslavement and convict leasing and Jim Crow systems, racial terrorism, sharecropping, exploitation through forced and unpaid and low-wage labor. So I wanted to show those things, but I also wanted to show resistance, the ways that people have of maintaining and asserting their humanity and dignity and complexity, and also the powers of story and community and memory and imagination, of political and intellectual and artistic engagement, of nature and love, and also of how that's connected to the ways Black people have always made a way out of no way. And so the seed for trying to open up the lived and emotional lives of imprisoned people was planted in me by my father, who was a criminal defense attorney. And the people he represented were not other or invisible to me. They were our people. And he embedded in me some understandings I've really carried with me, that everyone has a complex and important story, and that many people grow up without love or opportunity or choices, and that justice is a fiction for some of us. It also underlying the experience of many incarcerated women are histories of sexual violence and addiction. So the book is also about struggling with those things and making a journey of healing and self-acceptance and autonomy. Informing Renita's addiction are the ravages of her experience and inheritance, but she's also more than her trauma, and the generative resources around and within her can be recognized, claimed, retrieved. The novel is also a love story between two women who meet while they're locked up. And it's about the power of being loved with respect and generosity, of being challenged, and of being really seen. So an overarching theme then, I think, and maybe to everything I write, an overarching theme is loss and receiving. What has wounded us, and what can heal us, and what provides sustenance. And so another seed was given to me by a friend who was incarcerated. She offered me the pomegranate as a symbol of the precious and rare act of choice during imprisonment. And I started off being compelled by that idea, and also by the plain exterior of the fruit belying the striking jewels within. So in the preface, as Renita grieves the death of the mother who has pained her and wounded her in some ways, she's given a pomegranate by her father. And so I'm going to just read the end of the preface, actually. So he put the fruit in her hands. There's no making up for what's past, but this here, it's got some surprising and wonderful news buried just inside. Expecting a whole lot of nothing, her fingers studied the scratched and ordinary skin. He said they should wait to open it. Sometimes waiting made things better. You hungry, Lennox? Auntie Jessie asked, getting him a plate and listening as he told about the engine repairs and paint restorations that had filled his day. She kept him chattering while Renita muted their voices in her head, turning the pomegranate to take in its flat and faded spots, pressing on the sharp crown at the top. And then, when she was about to get up and wait on something else, he said, "Let's open it." Renita peeled back the rind and pried the bloodshot gems from the spongy membrane that held the whole thing together. She was struck silent, awed by the wild design of it and by the little bursts of sour sweet juice from the seeds that turned her fingers red. There was a whole world, strange and crazy beautiful, underneath the skin, layer on crooked layer of ruby crystals, and chambers like inside a heart.
Oh, I love that. Helen, I just love that image. And it was so the right passage to read. It's so central to the whole book.
Yeah. So the idea, buried in our hearts alongside the losses is abundance, and the beauty around and within us. The gifts we've been given, they belong to us, and sometimes we find our hands are filled with what we need. It might be through memory and story and imagination, and that gift might be something everyday or seemingly small or ordinary on the outside, and wondrous within. So I have a first question for you. So, as I said, going at this question of what wounds us and what heals us. And so I've read all your books, and and I'm wondering what you would say to this question. In the world of your novels, what heals? What are the healing forces for your characters?
I don't think everybody heals, is the short answer. I don't think everybody in my books does heal. Some people do. I think it's time and tenacity, and to some degree it is luck. In fact, it is luck. We've talked about this before, that there are certain things you find yourself writing about again and again and again. You don't do it on purpose, but it happens to me that every book I ever write, no matter what I think it's about, it ends up becoming a book about class. And that's natural. It's a function of where I grew up. I grew up in Northern Appalachia, in a little coal mining town, around the kind of people who didn't write books or necessarily read them or buy them. And so place is really central in what I write too. So I find that in the stories I write, the things that heal us are sometimes the same things that wounded us.
Mm-hmm.
Family is one of those things, that it's both the instrument of pain and the things that lifts you out of it. And that comes up again and again and again too. What about you? Are there things you just find yourself writing about over and over, whether you intend to or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think how people pull light out of darkness, that's what I'm always interested in that. And it's not that everyone does, like you said, not everybody heals, but though not everybody can either, take the abundance offered or has access to the abundance, like as my father, taught me. But I guess to name what the forces are, it feels important to me. So uh light out of darkness, and also I think the role of narrative in people's lives in various ways, the role of story, the stories that we're making about ourselves and our experiences and what matters to us, that we're doing that in an ongoing way. Sometimes we're doing it explicitly, and sometimes we're doing it artistically, and sometimes we're doing it more implicitly. But I'm interested in what always, I think, in what the function of that is and what that does to, sometimes to help us hide from the truth, but also what it can do, to lift us up. So yeah, I think those two things I'm always going at. And it's funny how sometimes we write about, about something without even realizing what we're doing. So my first novel begins with it's also the opening is about loss and receiving, and it begins with an act of family violence and then a gift of fruit. And here, and I didn't realize until I was finished writing Pomegranate that I had again begun with a gift of fruit. And that, in The Serpent's Gift, my first novel, it's an orange that's offered to a woman who's running from beating by her husband, and no one will open the door, and then somebody opens the door and offers her this orange. And I was trying to capture the duality of experience with the orange, the sourness and the sweetness, and that you're running, and for the child that's mother's running with, there's a total loss of I guess trust and the sense of safety, and with her father beating her mother. But then someone opens the door, so there's a loss in receiving there. And so it's interesting to me how I went at that. I was trying to talk about the same thing, really, those forces in our lives, and I ended up articulating it with the pomegranate this time. So
Another one of those things that I find myself writing about again and again, and I think it's one of those subjects for you too, is addiction. And without understanding this beforehand, a lot of my novels along the way include addicted characters. And I think that is it's a rich subject, it's a complicated subject. It goes to all the ways we try to medicate ourselves, all the things we do to feel better, thinking we're healing ourselves and doing ourselves harm. And it's something that comes up in Mercy Street at this clinic. There are not a small number of young women who come in to terminate pregnancies who have active addictions, and who understand that they are not able to parent at this moment in their lives. My earlier novel, Heat and Light, there's a central character who has been an opiate user and has been clean for a lot of years and is actually a counselor at a methadone clinic. But addiction is still part of his life every single day, both in the patients he talks with and managing his own emotions, his own compulsions, his own needs. And it's just, I'm fascinated by all the different ways people do that, all the substances we find to sort of to blunt the feeling of living.
yeah, I mean, the challenge of being awake, alive and awake, I guess, is what Renita is striving for. It's hard, right? It's seeing is hard, costly. Yeah. And I another, I think another potentially healing thing, but it's so hard and challenging, is being known and seen, and that's actually what Renita gets in the relationship with Maxine. She gets respected and known and seen, but it's also, that's no easy matter. So I guess I will turn that into a question about writing. I'm wondering, you're so fierce. I called you a warrior writer earlier, but I mean, you're both the way you approach writing, with such commitment and devotion, And I know maybe what's under the surface is more complicated, but you've always seemed so fierce to me. And also your narrative voice, is so unsentimental and exacting. And so I wonder, I think one of the hardest things about writing a novel is the way you're opening your head and heart to readers, and making yourself vulnerable. And so that's one of the challenges of being loved, or to be, for Renita to be loved and known, in terms of her queerness and in terms of her past with everyone in her life. So I guess I'm wondering, what would you say, what do you feel about that? Do you, is that difficult to feel exposed when you write a novel, or do you just, are you a
Um,
warrior in that way too?
You know what? It's not so much feeling exposed for me. It's more being an observer. Um, the thing I struggle with the most, the hardest part for me about writing, is believing I have the right to do it, feeling I have the authority to put my voice on paper. It's why, like, I can't write essays, for instance. I can't, writing in the first person. And I think that is a class thing and possibly a gender thing too, that to come up as a girl when and where I did in Appalachia, it was just not a thing that was done. You didn't hear women speaking with authority in any public way. And for me to write an essay in the first person, I freeze up. It's absolutely paralyzing. That doesn't happen to me in writing fiction because it's not about me. It's like turning a camera on the world. And of course, I am revealing all kinds of things about myself to anybody who cares to see them. But another I think result of the way I was raised is that I don't believe anybody's that curious about me. Like, I'm not that important or interesting. And so if I'm revealing myself, who's even going to care? It's it's not about me. It's turning a camera on the world as I see it. And whatever I reveal about myself is kind of ancillary. The hardest part is just working up the nerve to say, I am qualified to tell this story. I have the authority to tell this story. And 7 books in, 8 books in, that remains a struggle for me. It's really hard.
Yeah. How do you deal with that? It's the having a writing practice is the sort of, I think the whole, I don't know, the negative capability, to use Keats's phrase, living with uncertainty and mystery and maybe doubt and all that, that there is entailed in making any kind of art is pretty daunting. And I think I have a real capacity for that, but you can't do that in every aspect of your life. And so I've been thinking lately about how um, you have to have some kind of structure, something to stand on that allows you to make the imaginative leap, both, in terms of the story that you're creating, but also, as you say, in terms of who you are and your, authority to speak. So I think for me, I think I've been thinking about how it's about the habit and the practice that I establish, that then I can rely on that, and I do it, and I sit down and I do it because that's the habit I've established, and the stability of that, or the structure of that, allows me, to go these difficult places. So I don't know, how do you get there then if it's that hard?
Oh, it's all about habit. It's such a powerful thing. And I had a teacher, I did an MFA at Iowa, and I had a teacher, I remember him saying that writing in the morning, it's like getting up like a cow with the expectation of being milked. And it's a little bit like that. Like, I wake up and I'm writing in my head before I open my eyes, before I get out of bed. I'm an early morning writer. And the ideal to me is to just stagger to my desk before I'm quite awake and wake up in the process of writing, because there's something about being a little out of it that you self-censor less. It makes you braver in a way. You're not as critical, you're not as cautious. And so that clean mind first thing in the morning is essential for me. Like, I can only do it first thing. And
Yeah.
when I'm later into the process of writing a book and I'm revising, then I can work an 8-hour day. But in the early stages of creating something, making something new and putting it on paper, I need that dream state first thing in the morning, because I don't know, it's less scary then somehow. You're just sort of free associating on the page. So it always begins there for me, first thing.
Yeah. I have to do it first too, or I'll never get to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't let the world in. You know, I learned this. I can't let language in. Like I can't listen to NPR. I can't, look at a newspaper or read the headlines or God forbid talk to anybody. I can't, I couldn't possibly do that. I need to have no other language in my head. And then when I've done my writing for the day, then I let the world in. But that kind of clean brain, I want to save that for writing.
Yeah. All right. So I also wanted to ask you, I know that my mom gave me books to see by, and she's a literature professor, and even though you grew up in a town where where books weren't the religion or the currency, I suppose, I know that your mom was instrumental also in your reading life, and so I'm wondering what you would say has been the role of story, in your growing up.
Oh, it was huge. I'm old enough to have grown up without cable in a place where almost nothing happened. So all you have is small town gossip and storytelling. And because my town is really small, it's Western Pennsylvania, it's a town with 4 traffic lights. And my family has lived there for generations. My parents were public school teachers. So I know a lot about the people from my town. I remember the first time I took my college boyfriend back there to visit. We drove, and when we were about 15 miles from my parents' house, I started pointing to houses and saying, this is who lives there, and this is what they do for a living, and these are their kids' names and their ages, and this is where they go to church, and this is and I knew this stuff about absolutely everybody. And so there's something about growing up in a very small town that is excellent training for a novelist. It's you see the interconnectedness of people. And so that kind of storytelling that my mom and my aunts, around the dinner table Sunday afternoons, it was just a gossip fest. And I loved the pretending I was invisible and just hearing adults talk when they didn't realize kids were listening. And that kind of communal storytelling in my mother's family was really, really formative. The other thing was that, I had a religious childhood, and I went to church every Sunday of my life growing up. I went to 12 years of Catholic school. It's hearing the stories of church, hearing the stories of the Gospels, like that shaped my way of understanding stories too. But your question originally was about my mom, and my mom was a high school librarian. So she was responsible for putting a lot of good books in my hands. Both my parents were great readers, which was not that common a thing to be. Like when I was growing up there, I'm pretty sure that none of the kids I played with grew up with a dictionary in the house. I'm sure of it. And I've often thought that if I grew up in the house next door, I'd be doing hair right now. I probably would.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, books were kind of religion in my house, books and stories. I mean, the family stories, and my mom, it just nourished me that way, fed me books is how I think about it. And she also read to me poetry and stories, and then we talked about them, and so that was her great gift to me. And it was a refuge for me. I always felt full. I could always enter a book and both lose and find myself, I guess. And that's also true for Renita. That's one of the resources that she has that to get her through, that she's always and she's always loved to read, and she's always loved novels, and also the curiosity that her father imparts about the world that gives her a set of dictionaries, and those two things are, along with nature and music, and those are things that she has to draw on, and kinship, the family, as you said, families both gifts and and burdens, I suppose, so always complicated. So I was thinking about what the common ground is, between our books, and I think there's lots of it. Both books, I think, are in part about women's autonomy, bodily autonomy and emotional and psychic autonomy. And I was talking about choice earlier, and the pomegranate representing that, at least at the beginning of the novel, it kind of turned out that it gathered meaning as I wrote, and it comes to represent a lot of different things over the course of the book. But the gift of that from my friend, and and I think choice is necessary for autonomy, and both deal with the exertion of authority over women and our bodies and our personhood. So I do want I don't know what you would say about that in terms of your book, your novel, and then
Well, of course, choice is central to Mercy Street. Claudia is the daughter of a teenage mother who gave birth in the time before abortion was legal. And so
New York City. I don't like his face.
I-
I don't like his politics.
someone's not muted.
someone's unmuted. But
The medical examiner has ruled it as a homicide.
yeah,
He's also an ex-cop.
Pamela, I think you're not muted.
Paula, yeah, I think we're having a little
People who are homeless for
interference here.
subways, many of them in the throes of a mental health episode, and that's what I believe were some of the factors involved here. There's consequences for behavior.
Zach, Paula, can you help us out here?
Now listen, I'm fully aware that the people who believe that to be okay
All right.
are not going to have their minds changed by me making this video, right? The murder of houseless person Justin Neely on the New York City subway was not a consequence of his mental health episode. It was a consequence of his race and of his status. And he should not have been killed for either of those reasons. Neither of them.
Okay.
The minds that I'm hoping to change are those who believe that
Zach and Paula, can you help us? We can hear your conversation that you're having. Okay.
All
Okay.
right. So we were talking about choice and the importance of choice. And in Mercy Street, of course, that is central. Claudia, the main character, is the daughter of a teenage mother who didn't have the choice of whether to go through with the pregnancy. And it's a thing that Claudia is aware of, that had her mother had that choice, she might have chosen not to be a parent. And I think for Claudia, that understanding has been really central. And in working with the women she works with at the clinic, she's constantly thinking of her mother and her mother's lack of choice and how that was determinative for her. And it completely shaped the course of her own life. So choice is completely central. And this question of controlling women's bodies, of course, that's what Mercy Street is all about too. Every day Claudia comes to work at this clinic, and it is surrounded by protesters who are almost entirely men, not always, but much of the time the protesters are all men. And so it really raises all these questions about who owns women's bodies and who gets to make decisions about everything, about what their lives look like. So yes, choice. So I think that is certainly a commonality between our books. There's another one I find really fascinating, and Helen, I'd love for you to talk about this some. Both of these books draw on experiences we had sort of meeting people and interacting with people whose lives are unlike ours. And so your years of volunteering in prisons, teaching in prisons, and my years of volunteering at this clinic. And for me, it was a very different experience to write about something I had directly witnessed versus something I made up entirely out of my head. And second, to feel that I had an obligation to the world I was writing about, that it was not, I was a spokesperson. I was the one telling these stories, and these stories were not things that I had myself lived, but stories that I was privy to. And so it's ethically, it raises all kinds of interesting questions, and emotionally, it raises all kinds of interesting questions. I know that Renita is not based on an actual person, but certainly that world of prison, is something you experience teaching there. So can you talk about that some?
Yeah. So I wanted to, I mean, I am a fiction writer. I write, sometimes I write essays too, but I think of myself as a fiction writer. And so I wanted to write a novel, about the lives of imprisoned people. And I didn't really know, because of what my dad had planted in me, and I'd always cared about the issue. And so I didn't know what shape it would take, but I knew, I had not been locked up and I needed to somehow kind of earn the story. So I started volunteering, and that wasn't the easiest thing either, but I finally got the chance to volunteer at a couple different places. First at a county facility, House of Correction, where I was a volunteer on a whole unit that was an experimental therapeutic community. And for it was men, and they, at this facility you serve up to 2.5 years, and they'd been tended to be men who'd been in and out and in and out and in and out, a lot of addiction at the root of a lot of it. And so I was able to be one of many volunteers. Some people taught meditation or life skills, or there was substance abuse support, and there was a changing lives through literature performance of Hamlet, and there were a lot of things went on like on this unit, and we did it for a year, and then hoped that that the county would pick up, begin paying for it, and they declined to do that, so it kind of died, and then I ended up at a medium security prison. But anyway, I guess the reason I wanted to do it is because I thought that fiction has a unique possibility to help readers, live the lives or experience the emotional and psychological realities of imprisonment, and it's different from the kind of academic or sociological work on incarceration, and there's a lot of that, but there's a kind of a distance, a kind of academic distance to that work. So I thought, fiction has this different sort of capacity, or art has this different capacity. So I started volunteering, and then eventually I did it for 15 years, but then I eventually, for the last 8 years, helped to start this Penn New England program, which was explicitly a creative writing program. And that was the first stretch of years was with Houses of Healing, which is a emotional literacy program that is there are groups in prisons all over the country. And the first experience was more storytelling, or people had varying degrees of literacy. But then when we started the creative writing program, staffed by writers, volunteer writers, there was a real commitment, to the craft of writing. And it was very meaningful, I think, to the men and women in those workshops. And I learned so much. I feel like I was enriched so deeply by that experience. I mean, I was transformed by what people had endured, and the survival of dignity, and like that practice of divining what matters in our lives that I think happens when you try to write a story or a poem or an essay. And I guess the self-interrogation and the generosity I witnessed were profound. And it was an assertion of visibility for those writers behind the walls, and of meaning, and of their humanity. And I really do believe, in whatever context, the academic context of MIT, where I've taught for many years, or I've also worked with some, cancer patients or unhoused people. I've done teaching in a lot of different contexts, and always I'm just, amazed at the power of storytelling, and at how writing is an act of recovery and revision, revision of the self, and an act of power. And everybody, in those workshops brought forward our best selves. So I felt very indebted, to those participants in those workshops, and to others whose lives were touched by incarceration, who shared their stories with me. So it was and the novel, it was a profound experience. I feel like it changed me a lot. And then it also, my novel grew out of that. And I published a bunch of short stories too, that were part of an initial novel about 10 people who were incarcerated, 5 women and 5 men, in prisons down the road from each other, which was called Life Without. And Renita was actually one of the characters in that early novel that I sort of gave up on getting into the world, and I pulled her out of there, and she realized that she had her own full novel story to tell. But first I just like you said, you just listened, right? I didn't go in there with a pen and paper. For a couple of years, I just went and did the workshops and just tried to receive, what I could learn and what I could understand. And then it began to take shape what the story, I wanted to tell was. And it was important to me not to do that, when you're writing about people whose lives are different than yours, it's important to do that with respect, and not appropriate. And so I tried for that, I was honest with them about the fact that I wanted to write something, and I think they felt like, the opportunity to be seen with complexity and with humanity. They felt honored by that, and they were very supportive of the project of writing fiction out of that. But I was trying all the time, I suppose, not to enact another taking, or another violation or appropriation. So all those things, it must be done with a lot of care, I think, when you're telling other people's stories. And yet, we're always writing a novel it's a work of imagination, and we are using everything we know about the world, ourselves, and everything that's been, done to and for us, and everything we've done and been. And I certainly felt that way about Pomegranate. Like somehow I put everything I am and know into that book, and also the experiences of lots of other people.
Yeah. I think it's an act of generosity, but also it's an act of bravery, because when you're writing about imprisoned people, these are people the world finds easy to reduce and hard to love and easy to judge. And so the challenge when you're writing about incarcerated people is to convey the full complexity of the story that that lands a person in those particular circumstances. And to people outside that world, it is so very easy to simply look away. It's why we live in a country where people convicted of felonies can't vote, and that is a dead in the water political issue. Like, no political candidate can ever get anyone to care about that, because it's so easy to say, well, people who've committed felonies, they brought it upon themselves, they did these things, and it's very easy to pass judgment while knowing nothing. It's a very comfortable thing to do. So for you as a writer to kind of take the lid off that and look honestly and with some compassion at what lies beneath that, I think is an act of bravery.
Oh, thanks. I mean, it also is a writer's dream to have people peel back the layers of their lives and tell you, and especially for men, who don't share their feelings and their history so willingly often. That was also for a writer, that was remarkable. And the men that I worked with, a group of men for many years. I guess they were the thread through, even though I also worked at a women's pre-release facility in Framingham. But then at Bay State, I got to know them, and they were so wonderful to me and generous with me, and it was really quite a remarkable experience. So
yeah, I felt something of that working on this hotline, where the women who were calling, especially the people who were calling to schedule terminations, had stories, and they were all in the middle of an intense personal situation. Some of them really just wanted to make their appointments and get on with their lives, but there was a certain proportion of the callers who wanted to talk about the decision they'd made and why they'd made it. And so, when I started volunteering at this clinic, I was certainly pro-choice. I certainly believed in abortion rights, or I wouldn't have been doing this work. And I thought I knew a little something about abortion. As it turns out, I knew very little, and most of what I thought I knew was wrong. That the whole range of reasons why someone might choose to have an abortion is so much broader and deeper than I could possibly have imagined. And I think Mercy Street reflects that, the incredible range of people who find themselves in this particular situation. 1 in 4 American women, we know this, will have an abortion at some point. That means that abortion is so common that if you haven't had one yourself, you know someone who has, you love someone who has, your mother or sister or coworker or wife or daughter has. And of course, 1 in 4 women, that doesn't reflect the fact that every one of those unwanted pregnancies involved a man. So it's not just 1 in 4 women, it's 1 in 4 men have some personal connection to abortion. And I think part of the reason our political conversations about abortion are so polarized is that people who are opposed to abortion rights truly believe they don't know anybody who would do that. They don't know that kind of person. Tell you what, everyone knows someone who's had this experience. It is that common, but there's such secrecy around it, you know, for obvious reasons. It's not a thing that women have been able to speak freely about. So it perpetuates this fantasy that, oh, people like me don't do that. People like my wife, my daughter, my sister don't do that. You know, because it is a thing that isn't talked about, people who are opposed to abortion rights can cling to that idea that it's an othering that happens, that's other people's problems. It's other people who live their lives in ways I don't approve of. It's the othering. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of been very moving for me to do events about Mercy Street. Invariably, after I've finished speaking and answering questions and I'm, you know, sitting there signing books, a woman will come up to me and want to talk about her own experience of abortion. Very often these are women who are much older than I am, who are in their 70s or 80s, who had illegal abortions long ago. And I cannot tell you how many times a stranger has told me, I've never told anyone else about this. My daughter doesn't know, my husband doesn't know, my friends don't know. You're the first person I've ever told. And that kind of blows my mind that there are not a small number of women who have been carrying this secret for, you know, 40 or 50 or 60 years. So it is, you know, it is such a very common experience. It's not something that has been, it hasn't been possible to talk about it openly in a lot of places, in a lot of communities. And so I hope that the book kind of peels back the lid on that a little bit and makes people understand a bit more of the complexity behind this, that it's, you know, it's more than a political question, it's a life question.
Well, the book does do that. I mean, and I'm one of those women who's been silent about her abortion story. As you know, I've been working on an essay and trying to get the courage up to put that out into the world. But so, the silencing, the vilification by the right wing, it's and I guess to, you know, circle back to the sort of bodily autonomy question, I think, you know, so for Renita, it's the authority of the state, you know, via the carceral system, and the authority used to also to enact sexual violence, the authority exerted by cultural narratives about Black women's and queer women's bodies and voices that, you know, confuse and silence and thwart freedom and destroy power, you know, and that foster us being, you know, looked at but not seen and silenced, unable to raise our voices. And I guess you know, and political authority, I think politics are always played out on the bodies of women, and particularly Black women, and Black women's bodies are contended territory, you know, through which control, like personal and societal, is exercised, and the struggles between freedom and domination, you know, continues to play out through our bodies. And so I grew very interested. I mean, this sort of, I didn't sort of set out to write about this, but I grew really interested and became a central concern, like the body, you know, how social and cultural conceptions of our bodies shape our experiences, and how our bodies can't be denied, and how they keep records of our lives, you know. And then Renita really, she has seldom felt like her body was her own for a variety of reasons. And then that's compounded by what happens you know, when she's incarcerated. So, you know, that's another journey to healing and self-acceptance and self-expression, I guess. And this body belongs to me, and I will choose what happens to it.
Yeah. You know, this question of control, it's really what underpins the whole conversation about abortion, in my opinion. You know, so often people who are opposed to abortion argue it in religious terms, and it's kind of a conversation ender, because if you're not a religious person, can't agree on the parameters. But one of the characters in my book is an anti-abortion activist who is in no way religious. He is in fact an atheist. His reasons for opposing abortion are a lot more twisted. This is a guy who is very concerned about who's having children, how many children, and what color are those children. And this character's name is Victor Prime. He's somebody I feel like I've known my whole life because he's from my neck of the woods. He's from Northern Appalachia. And he is someone who feels that white people are being outbred, that white women need to step it up and do their part, that white people are becoming a minority in his country, and
replacement theory.
Completely. And when I wrote Victor Prime, I never heard the term replacement theory. This was not a thing that was talked about. It took me forever to write this book, and when I started writing that character, I didn't know that was a thing. I just knew that there were people who felt that way, and he's a person who feels that way, that feels that he has lost control of everything, that society is being controlled by people who are not like him, who do not represent his interests, who are not on his team. And so, he's got no problem at all with women of color having abortions, but it's when white women have abortions that's an issue because of the numbers. He's obsessed with numbers. He's obsessed with birth rates. And, I wish I could say I made that up out of whole cloth, but I didn't. That is real. That exists in the world.
Yeah, I was going to add too that, it's this whole idea that people are against choice because they can't imagine anyone in their families having an abortion. I mean, we also know from someone like Herschel Walker it's not even true. His
it's not even
paid for abortion. It's so, but sometimes it's simply political question. It's just about
calculation.
I mean, that's difficult times. Well, I was gonna say another thing, matter of common ground. I think I think our books are both about women struggling to create themselves, right, and feeling the pull of the past. And I was thinking about how Claudia, as the story culminates, not to ruin it for anybody, but she returns to the apartment where because I was rereading it, the last few days, where the father of the child she's carrying lived, having said about him earlier that he's her kind, that he's home, and sharing that food that she grew up with, with him. And then she returns to the place she was bent on escaping.
Helen, your screen froze.
She's not my sister. And then, I guess I read the dreaming about the giving birth to the mother as a kind of incorporation, of this mother who fell short in a lot of ways, as she's on the verge of motherhood. But I'm interested in how you see that act, that you build to. Is that an acceptance of self, an acceptance of origin?
Well, Claudia has a complicated, she has a complicated relationship to the place where she grew up. And I mean, I don't want to talk at all about the end of the book, but this is someone who grew up in a single wide trailer in Maine, and her mother made ends meet by taking in foster kids. So, her whole childhood was basically living in a foster family and being sort of a surrogate mother to these unwanted children her mother took in simply to make money. And so, that experience of where she came from and this sort of being haunted by the past and being haunted by the memory of her mother who has recently died and who was disappointing in many ways, and also whom she loved profoundly, and that relationship to that trailer in Maine that she ends up going back to. It's what we carry. These are the stories we carry. These are the places that made us. And God, I'm just incapable of writing anything that isn't really about place, because I believe in that so strongly. I myself am such a product of a place that it's hard for me to conceive of a character who isn't. So, in this case, some of the haunting, some of the painful memories she carries are intimately connected to that place.
Yeah. 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 Well, Renata is also trying to accept her full story, all of that. But, the first thing she says is, I live my life forward and backward, and to come to terms with that, to
I
that.
love that line. I love that line. And you know what? It's one of the truest things I've ever read about what novels are. It's about living your life forward and backward. And the truth of it is, we all live simultaneously in the past, the present, and the future. Like, you can't go 5 minutes without thinking about the past, or what you're going to have for dinner tomorrow, what you're going to do on vacation this summer. It's just, we're always living in multiple time frames. And there is no other art form that can convey that in the way that a novel can, that kind of simultaneity of time frames. And Pomegranate is all about that. It's about, how do you carry the past and face the present and even imagine the future when you've got all of that on you.
Yeah. And have the courage to go back, to return home, I guess, as Claudia does, as Renata does, actually, literally and figuratively.
Well, I hate to kind of step in here. We could go on and on. And thank you so much, Helen, for just a second ago mentioning that line. It's about forwards and backwards. I know, I was reading, starting the book this week, and literally just underlined, highlighted that line. It's one of my favorites. So thank you for kind of recalling that for us in this talk. And thank you both for such a special discussion. I didn't know I knew there was crossover with the themes of the books, but I didn't know you two knew each other so well personally. And I can always tell a difference when we have authors that have that deep connection. It just kind of resonates in these events. So I'm so glad you got together for this. And thank you so much for the discussion. I want to remind everybody that we actually have both authors' books in both our stores, San Francisco and Corte Madera. And Mercy Street was like one of a staff favorite and customer favorite when it first came out. And I know we're going to do really well with it in paperback. I'm so excited for that, Jennifer. And Helen has just definitely agreed to send us signed book plates that we can use for the hardbound first edition copies we have at Book Passage. And we love that and appreciate that. So,
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. And definitely go into our stores, give a call to our booksellers, or go online. In fact, you can tap the button right on this channel, our YouTube channel, if you want to order their books right now. So we definitely appreciate that. And until our next event, thank you, you two, and good luck with the tour of both your books. And Jennifer, we know you're putting together a new book, so we're looking forward to that. Definitely let us know when it's available.
Will do. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for having, and thank you, Jennifer, for
Thank you, Helen.
doing this with me and for all your support.